Good morning. My name is Elaine Xie, Professor and Chair of the Department of Communication Studies. On behalf of the Department of Communication Studies, we thank Dr. Kathleen Jamieson to be the inaugural speaker for the Karlyn Campbell Speaker Series. For over 140 years, the Department of Communication Studies has been committed to helping its students to become better citizens, articulate communicators, critical thinkers, and able advocates. The department's roots in written and oral performance, debate, the history and criticism of oratory, and the history and theory of criticism of both art and literature dates back to 1880. Maria Sanford, the first female professor in the state of Minnesota and a professor of rhetoric and elocution, led the department until 1909. She defined the rhetoric curriculum at the University of Minnesota in the post-Civil War period, worked to establish intercollegiate debating as an intellectual and civic good. She believed in her responsibility for civic action and offered public lectures. Continuing Sanford's legacy, Dr. Campbell is one of the most important scholars in rhetoric. Her unique influence charged the field of rhetorical studies to be ever vigilant, responsive, and creative in our engagement with the power of discourse. She credited her professional success to the valuable lessons she learned growing up during the hardship and deprivations of farming during war times. The speaker series she endows calls us to embrace rigorous scholarship, to share ideas freely, to learn from each other, to take lessons from the past as we shape our future, and to embrace our agency. For as she puts it, agency is communal, participatory, continually invented, crafted, effected through form, and transient and reversible. The department is proud to continue Dr. Campbell's legacy through our commitment to pursuing public goods by nurturing citizen, teachers, scholars to engage with our communities, by critically reflecting and challenging existing structures and infrastructures that silence the other. Social justice reflects and encapsulates the core themes of our faculty members' work. Together, faculty members and graduate students have investigated social justice on interpersonal, organizational, national, social cultural, and social political levels. The department has collaboratively and organically converged in addressing issues faced by a world in crisis. Through our research, teaching, and service, we're committed to generating resources and opportunities to support an environment that embraces diversity, accountability, community, and excellence. Thank you for coming here today to share the legacy and commitment of Dr. Campbell's socially engaged scholarship. I hope you will enjoy Dr. Kurmichiva's introduction of Dr. Campbell's legacy and Dr. Green's introduction of Dr. Kathleen Jamieson's work. I also want to thank Morgan from Event Services and our amazing staff, Carmen, Mark, and Tucker, for making this a great event. Thank you.
Thank you for being here. My name is Zurnica Kirimicheva. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Communication Studies, and it is my pleasure to speak to you today about the legacy of Dr. Campbell. Dr. Karlyn Kohrs Campbell's financial gifts to the University of Minnesota express her lifetime commitment to social justice, rigorous scholarship, and robust intellectual exchange. She devoted her extraordinary teaching career to educating students about the rhetorical and political history of African Americans, the civil rights and the women's rights movements, and the US presidency. Her passion for teaching these subjects was matched only by her commitment to researching and publishing exemplary scholarship in the same areas. Dr. Campbell was one of the most distinguished and decorated scholars in the field of rhetoric and communication studies. She received every major award given by the National Communication Association, including the Distinguished Scholar Award, the Endowed Arnold Lectureship, the Francine Merit Award, the Enninger Research Award, the Winans Wickens Award, Book Award, Her many professional contributions have been also recognized by multiple institutions. For example, she received the Distinguished Woman Scholar Award from the University of Minnesota, an Honorary Doctor of Humanities from Michigan State University, the Elizabeth Anders Award from the University of Ohio, the Mortar Board Outstanding Educator Award from the University of Kansas twice in 1976 and 1981, and the Distinguished Citizen Alumni Award from Macalester College in 2008. Despite such impressive accolades, Dr. Campbell never lost connection with her Minnesota roots, crediting her professional success to the valuable lessons that she learned growing up among the hardships and deprivations of farming during war times. Her bright and restless mind soon set her on a journey to places far from Blomkest, the small Minnesota town near her family's farm. Upon graduating with her BA from Macalester College in 1958, she pursued an MA from the University of Minnesota, which I'm also proud to say my alma mater. After building some teaching experiences as an instructor of speech, drama, and debate at Macalester College and at SUNY Brockport, and undergoing further education and formative experiences in Perugia, Italy, and Salzburg, Austria, she returned to the University of Minnesota, where she earned her doctoral degree in 1968. That was just the beginning of her extraordinary career. Despite an academic job market defined by advertisements stating that women need not apply, Dr. Campbell soon made her mark as an astute, engaged, and rigorous scholar who brought critical and historical perspectives to the key political struggles of her time. Her distinctive voice began to take shape with her 1970 original scripted series of analysis, The Rhetoric of Black Power, for KPFK, Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles. The series was nominated for the Peabody Award. In the years that followed, Professor Campbell's career as a teacher and scholar developed at institutions such as California State University, Los Angeles, SUNY Binghamton, City College, SUNY, the University of Wisconsin, and the University of Kansas. In 1986, she returned to her alma mater, the University of Minnesota, where she served as a professor in a 3-term chair of the Department of Speech Communication, which eventually became the Department of Communication Studies that we know and love today. Over the course of her career, Dr. Campbell emerged as one of the most important scholars in rhetoric. She shaped the field and carved new intellectual pathways where none had previously existed. Dr. Campbell's research on the rhetoric of the suffrage movements in the US virtually single-handedly founded the field of feminist rhetorical studies. Her published work empowered generations of scholars to look to the experiences and struggles of women and other marginalized groups as a source of political resilience, possibility, and critical imagination. For example, she authored a series of now canonical essays on the rhetoric of women's liberation, compiled 2 bias-critical source books of women orators, and the names are Women Public Speakers in the United States, 1800 to 1925, and the second volume from 1925 to 1993. And published her book-length study of the distinctive strategies women speakers used in facing sometimes violent opposition in US history. I'm referring to Men Cannot Speak for her volumes 1 and 2. Dr. Campbell's keen interest and insight into the political significance of public speech is also reflected in her distinguished scholarship on the rhetorical dimensions of the US presidency. Her collaborations with our distinguished guest, Dr. Kathleen Hall Jamieson, from the University of Pennsylvania's Annenberg School of Communication, resulted in 2 books on the genres of presidential oratory, Deeds Done in Words and Presidents Creating the Presidency. And this is why it is so special to have Professor Jamieson as being the inaugural speaker for this series. These texts have withstood the test of time and continue to fuel the study of the US presidential power. Dr. Campbell's subsequent solo publications in 2014 of The Great Silent Majority, Nixon's 1969 speech on Vietnamization, cemented Dr. Campbell's reputation as a critical scholar of the US presidency. By her own admission, her approach to Nixon's rhetoric in the war was formed through her experiences teaching in 1969 in a predominantly non-white school in Los Angeles. There, she taught and interacted with African-American war recruits and veterans who struggled to negotiate their military service abroad with their fight for civil rights at home. Her experiences amidst the civil rights movements of the 1960s shaped both Dr. Campbell's scholarship and her pedagogy. By authoring the Rhetorical Act and Critiques of Contemporary Rhetoric, two of the most widely assigned primers in the method of rhetorical criticism, Dr. Campbell excited generations of rhetorical scholars and demonstrated the critical possibilities of textual analysis. Her unique influence charged the field of rhetorical studies to be ever vigilant, responsive, and creative in our engagement with the power of discourse. Dr. Campbell's financial gifts at the University of Minnesota reflect her commitment to social justice and grow out of her ethos as a scholar and a teacher. The scholarships she endowed illustrate her desire to help bright undergraduate students who otherwise would be unable to attend the University of Minnesota. And the speaker series she endowed calls us to embrace rigorous scholarship, to share ideas freely, to learn from each other, to take lessons from the past as we shape our futures, and to embrace both what she called the promiscuous and Proustian dimensions of our agency. For as she put it, and Professor Shea reminds us, agency is communal and participatory, continually invented, crafted, effected through form, and transient and reversible. Each article and book that she wrote, each thesis and dissertation that she directed, and each gesture of support that she extended to students and colleagues throughout her career manifests what Karlyn Campbell termed, and I quote, the phoenix of female agency. And with this, I want to close my remarks by going a little bit off script to do one more thing that I know Karlyn would have liked me to do. And that is to give a shout out and express the love of Karlyn Campbell to all of her former students, some of whom are here, who I know have been really the source of her strength and of her hope. And I want to make a particular shout out to her most steadfast supporter, Adrian Christensen, but also the support of people like Kristen Middleford, Helen Warren, Deborah Peterson, who have been only a phone call away during Karlyn's most difficult times. And I'm grateful for you, and you're beautiful, and I know she knows it. So thank you.
Welcome. My name is Ron Green. I'm a professor in the Department of Communication Studies. I was the former chair of the Department of Communication Studies, and currently I am the chair of the Karlyn Campbell Speaker Series Committee in the department. One piece of procedure that I wanted to raise before I introduced our speaker. As you came in, you probably got a index card. We asked to, after Dr. Jamieson's lecture, we asked that you write your questions, if you have particular questions for Dr. Jamieson, and you write them onto the card, and there'll be those of us who will be walking around and grabbing them from you, and we'll be bringing them up here to manage the process. So that's why these were passed out, and I hope you kept it handy. I have the distinct and the distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Kathleen Hall Jamieson as the inaugural speaker of the Karlyn Campbell Speaker Series here at the University of Minnesota, sponsored by the Department of Communication Studies. Dr. Jamieson is the Elizabeth Ware Packard Professor at the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania, the Walter and the Lenora Annenberg Director of the university's Annenberg Public Policy Center and Program Director of the Annenberg Foundation Trust at Sunnylands. She's authored or co-authored 18 books, including Democracy Amid Crisis, Polarization, Pandemic, Protests, and Persuasion, with the Annenberg IOD Collaborative, Creating Conspiracy Beliefs, How Our Thoughts Are Shaped, and Cyber War, How Russian Hackers and Trolls Helped to Elect the President, which won the Association of American Publishers 2019 R.R. Hawkins Award. 6 of the books that Jamieson has authored or co-authored have received a total of 12 political science or communication book awards. And she has, as y'all know, has been a very active co-writer with Dr. Campbell. She co-edited the Oxford Handbook of Political Communication and the Oxford Handbook of the Science of Science Communication, In 2022, the Roper Center for Public Opinion Research awarded Jamieson the Warren J. Matofsky Award for Excellence in Public Opinion Research. In 2023, Jamieson was elected to the Board of Directors of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. She is a member of the American Philosophical Society, the American Academy of Sciences, and a distinguished scholar of the National Communication Association. Her paper, Implications of the Demise of Fact and Political Discourse, received the American Philosophical Society's 2016 Henry Allen Moe Prize. She is the co-founder of factcheck.org and its SciCheck project, and director of the Sunnylands Constitutional Project, which has produced more than 30 award-winning films on the Constitution for high school students. In 2020, the National Academy of Sciences awarded Dr. Jamieson its public welfare model, its highest honor for her nonpartisan crusade to ensure the integrity of facts and public discourse and the development of science communication to promote public understanding of complex issues. We could not be more happy to have Dr. Jamieson here, who will speak from Pizzagate to Fiendish, Pharma, and the deep state conspiracy theories as tribal genre. Thank you, Kathleen.
Thank you, Ron. It's a pleasure to be with you and to honor Karlyn Campbell and her legacy. And it's also a pleasure to see so many of the people whose lives she influenced. My life is among those. I was born in Minnesota. I was raised in Minnesota. I went to Wisconsin to go to Marquette, then went to the University of Wisconsin, but in the process was mentored by University of Minnesota professors like Bob Scott and Ernie Borman. And they had already at that point graduated Karlyn, Kohrs, Campbell. When I became an assistant professor at the University of Maryland, I published my very first article. It was about genre. That was only because my advisor, Ed Black, asked me a question about it. The question was so good, the answer couldn't be bad. And as a result, that article became my first credential as a scholar. Karlyn was organizing a national conference on genre. She was the full professor at the University of Kansas. I was a kid. She had no association with me, had no reason to know that I grew up in a rural environment in Minnesota as well, and should have gone to the University of Minnesota were it but for a scholarship at Marquette University to go there and engage in varsity debate. I wrote her a letter and said, I'm really interested in working on genre. I'd be happy to Xerox for the conference. I could help you arrange travel for the conference. I know you don't know me, but I'm really hardworking and reliable. Karlyn wrote back and said, would you like to co-convene the conference with me? That is Karlyn Kohrs Campbell. She not only broke down barriers because she was in a generation that was still facing every form of sex discrimination that there was in this field, including being interviewed for jobs on the assumption that the name Karlyn was a male name, only to have the astonished faculty find out that a woman was getting off the plane. Through a history of reversals that were undeserved, and she broke down every barrier, she confronted every injustice, and at every stage when she broke through, she carried the rest of us in with her. And that is a contribution to this field for which we cannot find the words to thank her enough. She created an environment for her students in which she championed both her male and female students, but in the process, modeled a mentoring structure in which her students became her family. And to those of you in that family who've taken such remarkable care of her in these last years, all of us who care about her owe you an incredible debt. I think it was Hubert Humphrey who said that you judge the morality of a government by how it treats those at the dawn of life, the children, those at the twilight of life, the elderly, and those in the shadows of life, the needy. You have a community that is established that the morality of the discipline that you are part of, the department that you incarnate, the tradition that you follow is alive and well in the level of care that you've given to this absolutely remarkable woman. I hope that she will have some small sense by listening to Z's presentation, and I hope it's being taped so that it's available for her, of how much we all appreciate those many contributions. I had the opportunity to see her yesterday and to tell her that we were going to celebrate her today and that we were all going to be very proud of those contributions. And I would like to ask you, just for those of you who knew her, to just spend a moment thinking about your favorite Karlyn moment. and send those positive thoughts to her. She's just down the way right now. I don't know that she knows we're here, but I think it matters nonetheless, because memory matters, that you individually just spend a moment recalling your favorite Karlyn moment. Thank you. I'm going to do something today that Karlyn would appreciate, because Karlyn was a perfectionist. I'm going to say that we got something wrong. And when you say to Karlyn, we got something wrong, that was an invitation to get something right. And as an aside, once we had the Barberry Pirates became the Burberry Pirates, inadvertently in the process of copy editing, thereby putting them into a peculiar color of plaid or shade of plaid. And it bothered Karlyn to no end that stood for a time uncorrected. She wanted to make sure that we got everything right down to those pirates. We said, when we wrote our first piece together in a volume called Form and Genre that came out of that conference that I co-convened with Karlyn, that genres are groups of discourse which share substantive, stylistic, and situational characteristics. I've underlined situational because somehow we lost the situational when we then said a genre is a group of acts unified by a constellation of forms that recurs in each of its members. These forms in isolation appear in other discourses, but what is distinctive about the acts in a genre is the recurrence of the forms together in constellation. The constellation metaphor creates a problem, as does the focus on the forms in the absence of an acknowledgement of the situational characteristics that inform. All of her other writings have the audience as a co-creator someplace embedded in them, and somehow our definition didn't catch that. So the problem is the metaphor of constellation, which we both really liked, because we were trying to say that this interrelationship of things is in part seen by an audience in a certain way, but there is an interrelationship that has a relationship that binds them in another way. The constellation metaphor obscures the situational elements, and with them, the audience's co-creation of meaning. At the core of our field is the idea that meaning is co-created. We've known that since Aristotle with the enthemy. So in the process, our definition shortchanged the agency of the audience. Agency, a key word for Karlyn Campbell. The complicity of the audience in the creation of meaning, the enthymematic nature of rhetoric, its soul. In the process, it also obscured a reality that we wrote throughout everything that we did, that the end of rhetoric is judgment in some form. The audience completes the act. To some extent, the audience constitutes the act that is ultimately the genre and is ultimately the communication. One could call it the rhetorical act. With that as the backdrop, and I'm going to come back to it at the end because I'm going to argue for the need to incorporate the co-creative agency of those who are interacting with the forms. I want to step back and say that what we argued across two books, in more embryonic form in the first than in the second, is that we come to know the institution of the presidency through its genres. We were trying to take on the notion that generic criticism is unimportant because it simply is a cookie-cutter method, that all it does is categorizes. It doesn't, as a result, tell you anything interesting. It's not critical. It's ultimately just descriptive. And what we were attempting to argue was, no, actually, form helps determine how you see function. And the presidency is defined through the genres, and they carry functions in through them, and as a result, we know the presidency through them. To some extent, take away the genres of inaugural and State of the Union and veto message and farewell and the like, and you no longer have the presidency as we know it. We were arguing that the genres are expressive of the identity of the institution. And in the process, we were acknowledging that the audience is participating in the co-creation. We just weren't making it as explicit as we should have in retrospect. But I want to start with the first idea that the identification of the institution is in part a function of our understanding of those genres. Catholic papacy is the same. I started my work with the papal encyclical. And the papal encyclical is actually an expression of the power of the papacy. The rhetorical structure of that encyclical carries in assumptions about authority, which, if granted and tied to the assumptions it carries in about natural law, carry in and reinforce a worldview that gives the papacy continuity and authority. So now we have two institutions in which you can say that there are genres of discourse that create concepts of identification that are at the core of what we understand as the institution, and they give power to those people who become the representatives of that institution. So I looked specifically at the papal birth control encyclical and argued it's a syntactically complex didactic letter written in a declarative tone in classical Latin, freighted with empirical protocols, an apostolic salutation and exhortation, and as a result, it carries forward into the contemporary world a worldview that's antithetical to that world was experiencing, because the genre also capsulized that worldview in time, and popes across time did not realize or failed to communicate their worldview out and impress the world with it, to the extent that you actually had a Catholic Church on the verge of schism over an encyclical that spoke from a set of assumptions, a worldview, and a rhetoric, a generic set of characteristics in ways that were alien to the world to which it was speaking. And that was the argument of my dissertation. It's essentially a genre argument, but it says we know the institution through it, and some of the power of the Pope is captured in that document. If he starts to deviate from those sets of assumptions, he's going to lose some of the core of what is given him power across time, and that's a dilemma for a contemporary Pope. I argued as well that you've got a worldview there, and you can begin to think about the worldview in terms of the premises that are assumed. Well, if you're assuming the premises, the audience is granting the premises. And so it's in some point for the Catholic papacy investing that rhetoric in those assumptions. It's granting them, and as a result, the encyclical has power. But at the point at which we stop granting the assumptions, we stop becoming accomplices in our own persuasion. As a result, the enthymeme underlying the encyclical fails, and what you get is the controversy over Humanae Vitae. The types of evidence are at play as well, his use of language as well, his rhetorical tone as well. Take those together, and what you've got is the previous definition of what constitutes the genre. Now let me leap forward. This is not going to be a speech that's going to tell you shouldn't believe in certain conspiracy theories. It's not going to be telling you that QAnon's premise that there's a cabal of pedophiles that actually run our media, run our government, and run our world, made up of Democrats. I'm not going to be telling you that that's false. I'm going to assume that you will grant that it is. I'm also not going to be spending a lot of time telling you that, as far as I can tell, it's not reasonable to think, and hence I will cast it as a conspiracy theory, that the pharma industry colluded with Anthony Fauci and the NIH and CDC in order to create a vaccine that would be put out to the masses, despite the fact that it wasn't effective and may actually be dangerous. In fact, it may actually be killing people, because their self-interest was gaining money and fame, also the whole series of other things they're supposed to gain, in collusive relationships that ultimately would be self-beneficial, and in the process include, for example, Bill Gates. I'm not going to be telling you that I don't believe that's true, and I'm not going to be arguing that it's not going to be true. I'm going to assume it is. I'm going to try to use these two, in other words, not to make a case about the conspiracy theories themselves. But I want to bookmark an assumption. We don't necessarily want to assume that because someone calls something a conspiracy theory, that it is false. Labeling something a conspiracy theory is a way of our saying we think it's false. So it becomes a rhetorical token. It becomes a way of deploying language to say, not only do I disagree with you, but you are outside the bounds of what is reasonably knowable in the available situation. And I don't want to make the mistake of having you hear, because I was unclear, that I don't think a conspiracy theory claim of itself is, we're not making a statement that the conspiracy theory, by virtue of using the label, is either true or false. By using the term conspiracy theory, what I will mean is unwarranted by the available evidence, the best available evidence at the moment. There are some conspiracy theories that turn out to be conspiracies, and then we stop calling them conspiracy theories. We just call them conspiracies. Watergate, Iran-Contra. And there are actual conspiracies. There are powerful people who engage in activities in secret that they do not want to share with us, the core of how you define a conspiracy. They actually do exist. And we don't want to say there never is such a thing, because then something might exist and we might not uncover it, and that could be highly problematic. So I want to be fairly careful with that as the backdrop as I talk about this, because it's going to seem as if I'm making some assumptions about conspiracy theories that don't have those backdrop assumptions in place. I don't mean to. I just know I'm going to need to be telegraphic. And what I want to say here is that the conspiracy theory genre, as a genre, and a genre is essentially a way of cutting things into a space to have you see them in a certain way. That the conspiracy theory genre, as I see it, is expressing a worldview, a mentality, and a mindset. It is the external expression of a set of antecedent assumptions that are built into the wiring of people's sense of how the world works around them. So instead of envisioning, and now I'm located inside an audience, not a speaker for the moment, and I'm going to be talking about adherents as people who grant this. Instead of envisioning an untidy world filled with randomness, with unintended consequences, with innocent action gone awry, and with new evidence, conspiracists envision one that is inhabited by powerful individuals who conceal malign activities and intent. There's no reason conspiracy theory couldn't be about something good, by the way, but I'm going to be using it to assume in this categorization structure that we're talking about malign activities. We know from those who have studied the psychology of individuals who are adherents that those who are disposed to conspiracy theories are lower in their tolerance of ambiguity, higher in their distrust of authority and governments and centralized power, and more disposed to a kind of binary thinking, one might say a traditional Manichaean worldview, in which there's good and there's evil. There are forces in contest with each other. And that is literally what a Manichaean worldview assumes. There are forces in contest. It's not just there's good and evil. There are forces in contest. If you take that set of assumptions, and that's the way you see the world, then you process a whole lot of stimuli differently than if your world has a lot of chaos and a lot of randomness and a lot of mistakes and a lot of things just go wrong. So my assumption is that there's an audience susceptibility here, and once one says that, one has to introduce the idea that there's a role for that set of assumptions in susceptibility to anything that is a form. That means that co-creative act is different for adherents than it is for the rest of us. And that's what we missed in the definition of genre. And what I'm going to try to do is to say, using these as an illustration, that there's some ways in which this iterates itself, in which, since we distrust authorities inside this worldview, and we have as a result a trust in ourselves, that certain kinds of appeals to constructing a world lend themselves naturally to kinds of interactions that we need to understand if we're going to understand why it is people believe in some of the things that for the rest of us just seem really bizarre, but also why those people in that world have a couple of interesting characteristics that bear on the larger rhetorical world. And what I'm going to suggest to you is that within some conspiracy structures that are broad enough, because of the tendencies I'm going to examine in a moment, you can constantly iterate out new versions of the conspiracy theory. It doesn't hold constant in space and time. Now that gets rid of the idea that there's a limited number of forms and they just get locked in because new players are going to come in. The structure may still stay the same, but new players may come in. You may have whole different iterations in which there's another theory out there and suddenly it gets assimilated in. So this is a different kind of genre. If you say it's got these characteristics, but it iterates out to create something that wasn't sitting here at point A, but after they get done with it, it still has those core elements, but now it's functionally a different kind of creature. But secondly, this kind of open-endedness gets them into a world in which they can grab other conspiracy theories and just bring them in and start to assimilate them. Now you've got a really interesting genre. And if we don't understand how that works, and we're concerned that some of these statements of a conspiracy theory entail forms of behavior that might be problematic, we're not going to be able to understand how we might talk with those not who are already deeply in conspiracy world. Because once they're deeply in conspiracy world, a world that's fundamentally non-falsifiable, we're not going to be able to talk them out of it into our world, which I assume for all of us is at least somewhat falsifiable. But we can say that there may be those who are kind of somewhat disposed to being in this world, but they're not there yet. And maybe we can hold them into a reality that's a little closer to where we are on those areas in which what we're saying is, as far as we know, there's no evidence of that. And here's the counter evidence to say, in the case of those that we think need to be discredited because they're just not comporting with reality, and here's the evidence that would lead you to say we're going to dismiss it. So my focus now is on looking at adherence inside the world in order to influence the susceptibles to that world. And as a result, to ask the question, will this generic perspective that says this form has a capacity now to morph, and it has a capacity to assimilate in, will that kind of understanding increase the likelihood that I can find ways to say to the susceptibles, hold in place and try to come back to the narrative that I have been offering you on grounds that are more traditionally considered scientific, using more traditional forms of evidence. And that's the argument that I'm going to make. So I'm going to argue that adherents not only create meaning of the conspiracy theory by investing the text with assumptions, but they also engage in creating evidence for and iterations of the theory. And I'm going to argue that conspiracy theory that actively involves its adherents in validating and iterating the theory can create tribal identification. And once you have tribal identification, I can impel you to action if I can create enough evil on the other side and mandate that there be action in order to protect tribe against evil other. And as a result, I can open to the possibility that you will get Edgar Madison Welsh with his gun, who goes and tries to free the children in Comet Pizza in Washington because he believes the children are being sex trafficked, sexually abused in the basement of that pizzeria. So that's what I'm going to be arguing, that there's a set of rhetorical implications tied to the ways in which one is accessing knowledge inside these structures that increases the likelihood that you get forms of tribal identification that can be moved to action if the conspiracy theory sets up the evil other as the perpetrator of the conspiracy. I'm going to argue that if this happens, and it doesn't inevitably happen, this is a possibility to happen under some circumstances in some kinds of theories. You're going to have an empowering move, an impugning move, a reframing move, and an expressing move. The empowering move is capsulized by DYOR. How many of you know what DYOR means? Raise your hands. How many of you do not know what DYOR means? Okay. DYOR means do your own research. Now, this sounds like something we tell freshmen in high school. Don't do somebody else's research. Don't just take somebody else's research. Do your own research. This sounds like something we should all do. DYOR. But inside this world, DYOR has a different set of meanings because it's framed, the doing of your research is framed within a structure in which the kinds of research you're going to do are going to connect the dots in ways that will put in place assumptions consistent with the theory. So, should we do our own research? Yes, but not in the meaning conveyed by DYOR inside these theories. Okay? First, identify patterns that elude or are disputed by experts. Identify patterns that elude or are disputed by experts. Save the children. QAnon believes that Trump is a messianic figure battling a deep state of devil-worshipping, child-molesting Democrats. That's the conspiracy theory. Actively involve your adherents in validating and iterating the theory. You see the Q with the white rabbit? That's the equivalent of DYOR, but now we have symbology tied to QAnon. White rabbit. How many of you are Alice in Wonderland fans? When you follow the white rabbit, you find the unexpected. It's a wonderful adventure. How many of you are fans of The Matrix and Neo? When Neo's told to follow the white rabbit, he's being invited to see a reality beneath a simulation. The white rabbit becomes the symbol of a set of moves to go to the reality under the fabricated world, under the illusions created by the experts, under the deceptions that they are offering you, in order to see the actual set of connections that are there that, if followed, will be consistent with the theory. It's a top hashtag among those within the QAnon lexicon, according to one of the scholars who works in this area in 2017. And when Elon Musk puts it up, QAnon gets very excited. Now, here's something I want to bookmark. when the storm, which is forecast by QAnon, in which the cabal of pedophiles will be exposed by Donald Trump, does not occur, and Donald Trump is not reelected, although they believe he was and the election stolen because they've assimilated another conspiracy theory. Effectively, the narrative, the predictive pattern of the narrative that's been offered has now been disconfirmed. So what would you expect? You'd expect in our world, in which evidence should be brought to bear on somebody's forecast. You say it's going to happen, it doesn't happen. Okay, now I'm going to call into question the people who told me it was going to happen. What happens when this doesn't occur? People start looking for an alternative to displace Donald Trump in the narrative. Musk posts White Rabbit. QAnon gets excited because Musk, powerful person with a voice now called X, now is signaling, or so they say. Or Musk is just waking up one morning and just decided it might be a good idea to play some games with X. Who knows? But if you think that's what White Rabbit means, now you've got a signal from a QAnon structure. And here's what you've got. Let me switch to the vaccine area. Patterns that elude or disputed by experts.
And then you find out they were vaccinated. And so it's like, okay, so it's the vaccine might be causing this.
We're connecting dots here. You know, there's no way that that type of obstruction would not cause stroke, heart failure.
My sister died. She was 58, and she died suddenly on Friday of a heart attack.
On any given day, people die. It is a fact. Whether we want to face it or not, it is a fact. The unvaccinated die and the vaccinated die. The question is, does being vaccinated increase the likelihood that you will die? Or does it increase the likelihood that you will live? You hope that it's going to increase the likelihood you will live, because that would mean that the clinical trials that established that you minimize the likelihood of hospitalization and death as a result of vaccination were correct. In other words, science had accurately forecast. But if the opposite is true, if the vaccine is killing, that's highly problematic. We would start from a science posture of saying, what's the base rate of death, particularly in the most susceptible population to COVID, the elderly population? And then, given that base rate, does vaccination change the likelihood of death? And if it changes the likelihood of death by increasing the likelihood that you stay alive, that's good for the vaccine. If it increases the likelihood of death by increasing the likelihood that you're dead, that's a bad thing. Now, if you trust the science that's available, that equation works out favorably for the vaccine. But you have to make the assumption that there's base rate level and that there's enough sophistication in the science community to make those kinds of distinctions. And that means you had to trust somebody. So if you're going to put into this, I don't trust the experts. I didn't see those people. I didn't do the autopsies. I don't trust the National Institutes of Health. And I know they're all in league with the pharmaceutical industry. Then you're not going to grant the science that tells you that we start with a base rate and what we see is benefit to vaccination and no harm to vaccination relative to the base rate of death. So what the conspiracy theory does is essentially takes your way of knowing off the table as a way of arbitrating your question. If you ask, well, what is it? Well, what is it? And how do you know in the absence of being able to have a method that would let you distinguish the base rate from the intervention, the rate as a result of intervention? Because you do have actual deaths. And the assertion here is, and the vaccine caused them. Now, you've also got a second problem at issue, because a temporal association is the basis of a causal inference. If you don't have a temporal association, you're going to have real trouble getting to a causal inference. But it doesn't get you to a causal inference. Apart from the temporal association, that is, the vaccine has to occur before the death, to have said that the vaccine caused the death, you've got to have some other things in line in order to get to the fact that it caused the death, because you've got the baseline problem sitting behind it. So if you make the assumption that simply because we see these two things coincidentally is interesting and important, we're going to look further, but we want additional evidence to figure out what that means, you're over in the world of science. But who's going to do that? It's going to be the expert, and we've already discredited the expert inside the theory. Now you're back to a world in which your experience of things is their basis for drawing inferences, and you essentially are in a world in which post hoc ergo propter hoc isn't a fallacy for you, because you don't have any way to determine that you've actually got causality, except for you see temporal association. And you trust your instinct about what you've been told because you've been told that the people who produce this aren't to be trusted. They're malign agents and they want to hurt you. Put that backdrop and assumption, it's perfectly reasonable in the absence of a scientific grounding to draw that inference.
The dead can't speak for themselves, so therefore I have to speak for them.
They will do with you what they feel like doing to you. It's the new bullet, it's the new missile, it's the new form of warfare.
Assume the malign agent, and your causal inference is warranted by the fact of the malign agent. And that's what you're seeing here. How is the claim being warranted about those people dropping after getting the vaccine? Apart from the fact that you're assuming that they've died as a result of dropping. But set that aside. We don't need to talk about that at the moment. Because you've already heard claims that people are dropping dead because they're being vaccinated. In fact, they're being dropped. That vaccine is so effective that the needle goes in and they drop, which is kind of an odd theory about how vaccination would work. But what you see is it's the argument from the malign agent letting you make the causal leap. Because they've put the bad stuff in the vaccine in order to accomplish an untoward effect. Or alternatively, they're so self-interested, they've put this together without doing adequate study, and as a result, they've increased high levels of risk. Any of those are encompassed by the theory. And then you get all kinds of instances in which people died after vaccination, and here are news reports of them aggregated into a book, and the inference is they died of the vaccine. And reports from coroners, reports from doctors, reports from families saying, no, they didn't. Discredit the source. Once you've discredited the source that will take you back to a scientific understanding, you've got all the power of an exemplar sitting here. You've got all the power of a dramatic, vivid instance. You've got all of the human processing that leads us to overgeneralize dramatic, vivid instances. So suddenly, take out the backdrop that we have of the scientific understanding that's in this other worldview, and accepting this almost becomes inevitable because of the way humans process dramatic, vivid information, particularly when you're seeing people like you who apparently are dropping dead as a result of the vaccine. Healthy young people, that's even worse. They're not like me. I'm a very old person, and they're dropping dead of the vaccine. What's your heuristic? My God, I must be even more vulnerable. Oh yeah, I remember. You've got all of these people, etc., dying suddenly. And you get the hashtag died suddenly. You get unknown cause. You begin to get a meme that digests it. And now it becomes a signal of identity. So I can signal that I believe this by hashtag died suddenly. Second characteristic, uncover confessional cues. Once you assume a narrative and you tell people, do your own research, they're doing it within the structure of the narrative. And in social media, they're doing it on a platform that is structured once you start to search within the narrative to feed you more of the narrative. And as a result, to reinforce the dispositions of the narrative. So we get a vocabulary. This is the Pizzagate vocabulary. And if we had time, and some of you know this theory well, we could explain how they got that vocabulary, this whole rationale of where it came from, what it actually means. I'm not going to do all of that, because this isn't actually about the theory. It's about how the cues are used in order to create a different kind of generic exchange. But take this vocabulary as a given, and then read this actual email exchange made public because of the Russian-hacked content from the DNC disclosed by Julian Assange in 2016. John Podesta, senior leader in the Hillary Clinton campaign. Does that look like an innocent conversation to you? Do you have things like this in your email right now? Could I find them? Have you, somewhere in your email, referred to cheese pizza, hot dog, pasta? I have. Now my email is disclosed, and I'm actually talking about feasting on tasty little boys. And why am I feasting on tasty little boys? Because according to the QAnon theory, by feasting on tasty little boys, benign, explanation benign in QAnon world is this is just sexual abuse, although that is horrific in that world as well. But also because by eating people literally, one gains a life force. And as a result, one will search and say, now because we're seeking cues to see if the people who are allegedly in this ring are giving us evidence that this is true, here's a picture of Hillary Clinton and she looks really tired. And here's another picture and she looks great. That could be makeup, that could be getting a good night's sleep, or that could be she just feasted on a tasty child. Okay? So once you say, seek it out, and you buy into the frame of reference, you can find evidence to support just about anything. Joe Biden is, of course, a pedophile in this ring. So take a picture of Joe Biden. That's his granddaughter. He's offering her a voter sticker, presumably asking to support her grandfather. That is not an evidence of a pedophile assaulting a child. But take it out of that context, and it can be used as that kind of evidence. We have a vocabulary that signals the tribal identification. You see the rabbit, follow the white rabbit. Connect the dots. Seek the evidence in structures that are going to increase the likelihood you're going to find the evidence. With a worldview that has very little that's random in it, it will find connections, and it doesn't have a clear causal understanding of how one would disconfirm a causal pathway once one seems association is there. And what we have as well is the tribal identification of WW1WGA. How many of you can translate that? Those of you who are studying the theory. How many of you understand that Donald Trump is not engaging in a meteorological forecast in that visual? Because the storm has special meaning inside this vocabulary. And once you have the vocabulary translates together. Okay. Where we go one, we go all is a statement of tribal identity. It's a statement, one of us is all of us. So now what we have is this process of engagement with others and engagement with the world through this lens is creating a tribal identity of symbols of tribal identity that are also consistent with symbols that reinforce the theory. This is a process by which you've got active engagement with a genre. The creation of the genre is occurring out of this kind of signaling system. And our definition didn't encompass this. Now, NBC News is going to offer you a piece of news from the day, just a piece of news.
Thank you very much, everybody. From the Oval Office tonight, President Trump with a wink and a tease. Thank you very much. You'll find out. Revealing no new details about the meaning of this cryptic comment during a reception with military leaders and their spouses Thursday night.
You guys know what this represents?
Tell us, sir.
Maybe it's the calm before the storm.
What's the storm?
Could be the calm before the storm.
What storm, Mr. President?
You'll find out.
Now, the rest of that NBC piece is going to talk about potentially it's a threat to North Korea, potentially it's a threat to Iran. That's why it makes sense in the context of military leaders. NBC isn't going to go on to say that's a QAnon signal. But if you are inside a QAnon vocabulary and you think Trump is the savior, the messianic savior who's saving you from the pedophile-based cabal and is going to bring the storm where he is going to ultimately unmask them, he's just sent you a signal. So for practical purposes, what you've got is a communication signal that is ambiguous, and Donald Trump, and asked about it, maintains the ambiguity. You could say, speaking from a perspective favorable to Donald Trump, of course, I'm not going to tell North Korea what I'm going to do. I'm not going to tell Iran what I'm going to do. But from QAnon's statement, he just said, I'm one of you, and the storm is coming. And with military leaders attached, you're playing into the basic concept of the theory. So if you're looking for the cue, you can find the cue. Whether he intended to communicate or not, an open question. QAnon interprets it as the violent day of reckoning, the end of the deep state. NBC interprets it as a warning to Iran or North Korea. So we have empowering as our first stage. Now we're going to impugn. I've already forecast this argument. We've got to discredit the sources that you would turn to ordinarily to ascertain the alternative reality against the conspiracy reality. And those are the sources. I run factcheck.org. I co-founded factcheck.org. Factcheck.org goes to consensual sources that are custodians of knowledge, consensually granted, things that audiences grant. So you give us a statistic about unemployment, we'll go to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Give us a question about vaccination, we might come to Mayo. We'll come to a doctor, researcher in the area. We'll look for a meta-analysis in order to see whether we've got consensus on evidence. We'll turn to the CDC, NIH. That means we're turning to sources that are already distrusted, so there go the fact checkers. But by the way, the fact checkers should be discredited as well, because the fact checkers are part of a journalistic establishment, and the journalistic establishment is in service of the deep state. And for practical purposes, we give them cues that are consistent with their fears about us. So you'll see at the end of this presentation, I am going to thank the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. I'm going to thank the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation because they provided funding for us to do scans to find out about vaccination misinformation and to create a typology of it so that we could better identify patterns that we could debunk as patterns, not as individual instances. So that's why we took money from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation was ultimately founded at the very beginning with Johnson & Johnson money. It has Johnson & Johnson stock, so since we took money from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and they have stock in Johnson & Johnson, and they were founded by Johnson & Johnson, the Johnson & Johnson people who are creating the Johnson & Johnson vaccine have corrupted factcheck.org, and you can't believe what it is we've said about vaccination. Now, how would I counter-argue if someone made that claim and that claim has been made? I would say, read our fact checks. Find me one word in the fact check that's favorable to Johnson & Johnson. And the reason I would say that is because Johnson & Johnson had a vaccine with a big problem. And what do fact checkers do? We fact check things that are a problem. That's the vaccine that we don't use anymore because of blood clots, rare but nonetheless existing blood clots. And as a result, its profile was less favorable than the other vaccines. And that's why it's not being used anymore. But they don't go to ask, what do we say? Or they looked and couldn't find anything we said that they could use for evidence. And the practical matter is, if you start with distrust, why would you trust us when we took money from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation? It has the word Johnson in its name. And there is a Johnson & Johnson vaccine. So we're living in a world that goes back to Sextus Empiricus. Sextus Empiricus said you could ultimately find ways to discredit anything. You just had to challenge the grounding premise and challenge every piece of evidence. And I would add, challenge every source you're going to look to as an expert source, because you can't ever ground your argument. What the conspiracy theorists do is make it impossible to ground an argument about the counter-reality. Once you accept that science has been corrupted, and that you'd, as a result, deny that all the protections that are put in place through the very complex clinical trial process actually yield reliable knowledge, or more reliable knowledge than alternative methods. Once you deny that, you don't really have a place to go, given that you've got two counter-narratives on which you can stand to get them to move to where you stand. We've assumed a common culture, we've assumed common premises. Conspiracy theory undermines those premises, and the minute it puts those things in place, you can't move those who are inside that world from that world. The only thing to do is deal with those who are susceptible. So we've already said you can discredit the expert sources because we've got the collusion narrative about Big Pharma and NIH, et cetera. By the way, that's what all those protections are in the clinical trial process. It's against potential collusion with Big Pharma. That's what all that is there for, because we've got another uncomfortable fact, which is we tend to develop a lot of knowledge in the federal government section. We turn it over to commercialize it in the United States, and then it comes back in the form of government recommendations about vaccines. If you're sitting inside the conspiracy world, that looks a little suspicious. Science recognizes that that looks a little suspicious, and ideally, that's not the way you would do it. For practical purposes, that's what all those protective layers of review are sitting underlying the clinical trial process. And parenthetically, it's not my argument for today, but parenthetically, we have set up a chart that shows that elaborate review process, many stages of independent review with no pharma representatives on it. Simply showing people that chart of review increases the likelihood that people will accept a new vaccine. The public largely doesn't understand the way in which science protects itself from human bias and political bias and financial bias. It's the reason we disclose our financial donors whenever we publish. Any financing in an article published in a journal is supposed to be disclosed. If you don't do that, your article is supposed to be taken down. Why do we do that? Because we are influenced by money. We all know we are. So if I've taken money from somebody, I want you to know, so you look really carefully to see if there's any chance that that influenced it. So we've done things to protect ourselves from human bias. They're not perfect, but they're there. But you're not going to have any confidence in them if you start from a premise of distrust. Let's look at how we get rid of the scholarly journals that have published and the material that's published in scholarly journals. Our knowledge about science doesn't come to us directly. It comes to us through reports of government agencies pre-publication and ultimately through peer-reviewed publications and all the critical scrutiny they get and the corrections that are put in place, because it's in my self-interest to critique everybody else's science, and it's their self-interest to critique mine. So we correct by critiquing each other. We've got a culture of critique. We're rewarded for taking down other people's science. You know, we're not praised. We're rewarded for taking it down. We're not praised for collusion. We're rewarded for critique in the culture of science. On the ballot now in a number of states, including Michigan.
I mean, that's what we've been talking about from the beginning. Gates has these incestuous relationships with Anthony Fauci that go back 20 years, where he's, paying Fauci, and they have all kinds of really corrupt financial entanglements with each other.
Okay. Now let's take down the publisher.
Because I think most physicians are victims of the lies propagated in the high-impact journals. That is a whole issue. What's happened to the high-impact medical journals over the last several decades, how they've been completely captured and run by the pharmaceutical industry, means that the pharmaceutical industry can get doctors to believe whatever they want.
Okay. Now, in a connect the dots world of follow the rabbit, in which you have no way to ground a counter-argument in any of our traditional forms of expertise, because they are all distrusted, what you have is a self-reinforcing conspiracy world that is recreated every time someone engages in a search process. They actively create the genre. And in the process, they're also increasing their susceptibility to the two other tendencies I suggested, morphing it out into new iterations. If you are able to discredit part of it, the storm didn't occur when it was supposed to, but also assimilating in other conspiracy theories. Okay, we've done empower, we've done impugn. Now let's look at reframing instances of institutional self-correction. The academic community, the scientific community is supposed to engage in self-correction. We're supposed to honor people who find mistakes and correct. We're not supposed to punish them. Our tendency when we make a mistake is not to want to admit it. We're trying to find ways to punish you when you make mistakes and don't admit it, and to reward you when you do. But we're also trying to catch instances of fraud and abuse and everything else, because humans engage in those too. Humans are venal individuals at just the same rate across all the communities. There's no reason to think there are less of them in one community than another. So the question is your culture able to catch it? And when it does, how do you treat it? So if you catch it, and catching it becomes evidence that you are in fact complicitous in this malign process, your very process of protecting the integrity of your knowledge becomes a process that is used as evidence that you don't. We start by taking instances of individual actual action that is horrific and problematic and overgeneralizing it. It's not that inappropriate activities with those underage don't exist. It's not that sexual abuse doesn't exist. It's not that sex trafficking does. It does. It's horrific. It does exist. They start in a place where they've got instances of powerful people engaging in activity that falls within that general domain, and they've got a general problem that does exist. And it's a cause for concern. They don't start in a place that has no cause for concern. There's cause for concern, obviously. You've also got instances in which we've been misled by pharma. Big instances in which we've been misled by pharma. We've taken medications that we were told were going to be good for us, and they've caused problems for us. Medications have been withdrawn. We've got an opioid crisis that we should not have had pharma behaved responsibly. Pharma has lied. So you've got those instances. So now we actually have people inside this world who say, hey, wait a minute, we're not making stuff up. We're starting the same place you are. Don't you grant these things? Of course we do. They're actually there. The question is, do you think when we find them, our evidence of having found them and showing them to you is evidence that we're engaging in behavior to minimize the likelihood they will recur or not? Or is our finding them just the tip of the iceberg? We haven't found the rest. They're actually generalized activities. Now, there is your difference between perspectives and the worldview. It's also whether you fundamentally are optimistic about the way in which structures are able to constrain and norms are able to constrain, or fundamentally pessimistic about whether you think those things can constrain. So maybe they manipulated the clinical trials. Did all those protections actually catch it? Well, what science says is if they didn't, we'd know by now because all these vaccines have been given and we would have spotted the problems. But no, we don't trust that because that's also data and we don't trust that that hasn't been manipulated. And this one's personal to me because I took Vioxx before a major back surgery, and as a result, my creatinine level is way out of whack with where it should be. I'm not a big fan of pharma. I do believe we've got protections in place in the federal government that make it very difficult to get things through that clinical trial process and that approval process. And mistakes are made. Sometimes they get things approved that shouldn't be and they withdraw them. Because I'm fundamentally on the side of optimism and on the side of I understand how clinical trials work. If they're conducted well, they give us a form of knowledge that's more reliable than our guesswork. Joe Rogan, large audience. And treated very unfairly, by the way, over his taking of ivermectin. So attacked for using a horse dewormer, he did not use a horse dewormer. He used human ivermectin, authorized by doctors, able to be used off-label. And by suggesting he took a horse dewormer, one simply gave him evidence that that whole world out there that it believes in science actually is hypocritical. Something the FDA, by the way, is having to deal with right now because they put out a tweet that never should have said what it said, which it basically conflated the ivermectin that humans take for very good reasons for other things and horse dewormer, ivermectin, which is very valuable if you're a horse. It's in a different dose and it doesn't have the same purity checks. But it is ivermectin. And Rogan is legitimately aggrieved at the way that was treated in the mainstream. And when that mainstream makes that mistake, it looks like the deep state has co-opted mainstream media.
Just died suddenly. You ever go to the died suddenly Instagram page? Like, holy shit. There's so many. And so many people like talking about people who are, anti-Darwin, anti-vaxxers, and then you're dead. Sorry. You bought into the wrong bullshit. But that's, if you really want to get cruel, that's Darwinism. Do you not know they lie by now? Are you not aware of the opioid crisis? Are you not aware of Vioxx?
Okay, there's how you ground. You ground back in. Don't you grant that? Well, then grant me this. Tracy Beans.
Back in March and April of 2020, we all told you that this virus originated in a lab. But because China, we were told we were crazy conspiracy theorists and we were banned from social media. Credible journalists who reported on this, the State Department, President Trump, were all labeled as crazy conspiracy theorists who had no idea what they were talking about. This is like the umpteenth example of the conspiracy theorists being right. So when are people going to listen to us about the vaccine? When it's too late. We've been trying to warn you.
Legitimate scientists cast the lab leak theory as a conspiracy theory to take it off the table as a hypothesis when they should not. We do not know what the origins were. We have competing hypotheses right now. And when you take a hypothesis off by labeling conspiracy theory, and you then have evidence that it may have been more viable as an option, as a hypothesis, than it was thought at the time. It never should have been completely dismissed out of hand. You get attacked as scientists for having done that. Here's the article. The scientists said it. Here's the media. They picked it up. Factcheck.org did not. But other fact checkers did. But it wasn't what science ultimately said and did. Ultimately, other scientists, because we have a culture of critique, said we want the evidence. China is covering something up, if by that you mean they haven't disclosed all the evidence that's available. And as a result, you could say that we have a conspiracy theory that I would not put into I assume it's unwarranted by existing evidence, about the possibility that there is something being covered up in China. We do not have the evidence right now to adjudicate the competing claims about the origins of the virus. But what does Tracy Bean say? We were right. You attacked us. And she's right. They were attacked. As a result, we may be right about this too. So there are times in which we create our own susceptibility because this is bad behavior by scientists in the scientific community. This should never have been published. Finally, express tribal identity. Here's your language expressing tribal identity. I've already given you instances. Here's your evidence expressing tribal identity. Here's your evidence expressing tribal identity. Once you begin to wear your identity, and where we go one, we go all, is your self-expression, you have tribal identity. And once you've got tribal identity, and an agent that is perceived as evil or a process that's perceived as evil and fundamentally threatening children, innocent children, an election that's been stolen, we now have people primed to engage in some form of action. This is Edgar Madison Welsh.
I love you up more than anything in this world. I can't let you grow up in a world that's so corrupt by evil. Without at least standing up for you, for other children just like you. Like I've always told you, we have a duty to protect people who can't protect themselves. I hope you understand that one day. I love all y'all.
He believes he's going to save the children in Comet Pizza. He has become an expression of the theory. He is now an agent of the theory trying to address the challenge set by the theory. The evil is affecting the children. He is going to do the natural thing in that narrative and become the hero. So the impulse out of tribal identity is to create a capacity for action that can be, and underline can be, not necessarily will, not always will, can be problematic. What happens when he finds there are no children, there is no basement? The intel on this wasn't 100%. Those children may be someplace else. In other words, for him, the theory is non-falsifiable. Save the children as tribal expression of identity. We're carrying signs. And a real organization that is devoted to saving the children has now had its identity hijacked. So, summary. What makes this genre different, and which requires that we rethink the definition that Karlyn and I initially offered, is its capacity to make appeals that empower, impugn, reframe, and express, and as a result create the possibility of tendency toward action, which means a definition of genre as the thing that just sits out there as a constellation, even distance, because constellations are far away, is really metaphorically recast. We got trapped by our metaphor. We got trapped by our effort to try to see relationship among the forms, and in the process we lost situation, we lost audience. Quick overview of argument 2. There are ways we can reduce some of this susceptibility, and a generic perspective helps us do that. We can first reduce susceptibility by avoiding language associated with existing conspiracy theories, because that provides the first dot in connect the dots. Here's nanoparticles.
This is the ingredients for the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine. We actually get to have a look and see what is in here. I'd like to draw your attention to these couple of things. The lipid ALK. And they are the lipid nanoparticles that carry and protect the mRNA from degradation. We know that this is the first RNA vaccine ever made, and we know that people have been talking about nanotechnology and people being injected with nanotechnology. Well, there it is. You have to say that that is what's happening. Nanotechnology is made out of nanoparticles.
It was already out there. There's no reason that you have to call them nanoparticles. They're lipids. They're synthetic lipids. And they enwrap the mRNA in order to give it a delivery capacity that ultimately lets it work with the endosomes in order to move through the process that mRNA works through to create the spike protein. to be recognizable, and as a result, the system defends against it, and you get the protection of vaccination. But for practical purposes, they had a choice, but they weren't thinking rhetorically. They weren't looking at the audience susceptibilities. They could have called it lipids. They could have called it a lipid envelope. The minute you use nanoparticles, you're feeding into and now bringing all those. Bill Gates is putting nanoparticles into the vaccine in order to create these effects in people. That started, the first dot was started with the use of the word nanoparticles. You have to work to make lipid the first dot. You don't have to work to make nanoparticles the first dot. Now think about luciferase. Those of you who have a Christian theological background, do you see a word there that you know? So imagine that luciferase is used anywhere in the process. Now, luciferase is not in the vaccines, but luciferase is used in some of the testing processes involved with COVID broadly. So it's not that it's not there someplace. Whoever coined the word luciferase was obviously trained in classical Latin. Lux lucis means light. And what is Lucifer is the angel of light. What is luciferase? It's a light capacity. It's a fluorescence capacity. As a result, you can use it to tag something because you can see it. So somebody said, well, obviously, we'll just use light, but they weren't thinking Lucifer for a whole part of a population that is already on a conservative end of a political spectrum. Is not a word that ought to be out there as you're talking about COVID in general or vaccines in specific. And then what you have is now people taking that and beginning to associate and look for cues because they've connected the dots. Now, they're wrong that it's in the vaccine. It isn't. But talk about that later because they're now looking for things that have 666 associated with them. What is 666? It's the mark of the Antichrist. It's the mark of the devil. It's the mark of Satan. So if this is actually some insidious plot, it will have some 666s, so they're going to go connect the dots and find some 666s. And by the way, if they find anything that the process mentions Inferno, and there's a platform capacity called Inferno, now you have Inferno tied to 666 and the admission, the first dot, of luciferase. So first, it's not in the vaccine. See, this is us doing our job. Now, we're running the risk, we're actually reinforcing in the process because there are people who didn't know there was luciferase. They're saying, aha, there's some Lucifer involved with vaccines. So backhand fact-checking has its problems. That's why I have a protective knowledge model. You try to get your knowledge up ahead and not on the back end, you don't risk this. Since conspiracy theories are built on distrust of experts, rely on individuals who are part of the community to communicate your scientific knowledge. That would be your high school, community college biology teacher, your University of Minnesota, the folks who are trusted in their community, biology teacher, your minister, your local healthcare provider. They all have high trust and they all can communicate science. We don't have to communicate science at a federal, national level. We should be communicating at the local level anyway. It's far more important because we're more likely to believe people who are like us in our own community who can actually show us that we're engaging in the behavior. I mean, do I trust that some at the federal level is actually taking the vaccine when I see that maybe that's a fake vaccine, maybe they just pretended that was a vaccine? When my friend says, I took the vaccine, I believe my friend. You can get past a lot of that distrust to come down to the pre-existing trust you've already got for people who are local. Here's what I want them to tell me. This is from the AP fact check about the luciferase claim. I want them to tell me why they're named luciferase. They contain an enzyme. Here's what the enzyme does. It's a light-producing enzyme. I want the biology teacher to tell me this. I want the pastors to say, no, there's nothing Luciferian about the vaccine. I got it. I'm fine. We're going to be vaccinating in the church parking lot. Encourage you to get the vaccine. By the way, our healthcare provider is here. Talk to your healthcare provider if you've got questions. I want them to say, some posts are misrepresenting the vaccine. This is what it actually does, and it's not in the vaccine anyway, so don't worry about it. They're not going to believe that from Anthony Fauci. They're going to believe it more likely from someone they already trust. Virtually every study done on trust says local trust is higher than any kind of national trust, including among liberals, including among Democrats. I'm going to show you the vial. Now, I'm off in the susceptible world, where I'm going to show you the ingredient vial and say, look at all these things, see? That's certified by people who looked carefully at it, and I'm going to hope somebody at the University of Minnesota did that, and I'm going to say, see, there's no luciferase. And I'm going to actually have somebody who's trusted do the search and find out that, no, the only patent that's got a 6.6 anywhere in it was put in place in 2018. And the vaccine hadn't been developed at that point. Okay? And I'm going to tell you about the computer program called Inferno and tell you what it actually does. I'm going to try to displace, in other words, actually what things do with what they're alleged to have done. I'm going to try to disconnect the dots for the susceptible. And I'm going to use the credible sources to do it. Finally, I'm going to remain true to the norms of science. I'm not going to do something as stupid as dispatch something that's a legitimate hypothesis in the presence of undisclosed evidence with scientists trying to get the evidence out of China and failing. I'm not going to dispatch that as being a conspiracy theory. And if I do, I'm increasing susceptibilities, and that's bad on my part. That's the fault of the scientific community and those who published that. They created a vulnerability, and they did something that violates the norms of science. So what have I argued? We can reduce susceptibility by avoiding language that's already associated with conspiracy theories. We can use trusted local experts. And we need to stay true to our norms, and when we make mistakes, admit them. We always run the risk that those admissions are going to be used back in the theory. I've already dealt with that. But if we can stay with the trusted individuals, we may be able to provide a breaker on that inference. In general, what I've argued is adherents not only create meaning in this genre by investing the text with assumptions, but they also engage in creating evidence and iterating the theory in ways that make it susceptible to new morphings of itself and assimilation of other theories. And as a result of creating the resulting tribal identification, they increase a tendency toward action that can be deployed in ways that are problematic. In my judgment, that happened on January 6th. In my judgment, that happened to Edgar Madison Welsh. And I've argued that a generic perspective can help us figure out where we can go to interdict those susceptibilities as best we reasonably can, understanding that at the best, we will probably be effective at the margin, but nonetheless, on matters that are consequential, it's important that we try. What that means is that my definition of genre now, and I think Karlyn's would be as well, would include this notion of agency. And so I'd say, provisionally, a genre is a group of acts unified by the interaction of shared audience interpretations with a constellation of forms that recurs. These interactions in isolation appear in other situations. What is distinctive about acts in a genre is the recurrence of the form and interactions together in constellation. Funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Please look at everything we've written about vaccination. If you have any doubts about our integrity, and factcheck.org. This is my team. Thank you. I'd be happy to take your questions. My tea. My sister brought me tea. I've got tea. Ha, ha. And I know I've run late, so I'll stay after and talk with anybody who has unanswered questions.
Thank you again for your generous time. And here I am shuffling it because I know that I expected that there will be many questions. And of course, the audience never disappoints. So let me just quickly shuffle. And if there's some questions that are kind of in the same realm, I hope you won't mind if I combine them a little bit. Thank you. Okay. Lots. So I will start with one, which thankfully self-identifies as a rhetorical scholar. So, an in-house question. Avoiding specific...
You know, in-house has an antonym.
So yes, this is we're now part of the conspiracy, so here we are. Avoiding specific words or terms seems difficult, given your point about how elastic the tribal genre can be. How can that work with the spread of mimetic communication on the internet in these conspiracy theories communities? Is this generic perspective just a mitigation with conspiracy theories? So I think the gist of the question has to do with the way in which kind of we respond to the conspiracy theories, but that the very response then gets folded into the conspiracy theories and fuels them.
Yeah, that's the reason for saying I'm focusing on the susceptibles, not the people already inside the theory. Once you're inside the theory and you've got a reasonable amount of vocabulary built, you're gone. From a world in which I can engage. I mean, rhetoric's about engagement. It's about adjusting people to ideas and ideas to people. And at a certain point, people are inside a world in which you can't adjust because your world and their world are just incommensurate. But the point, obviously, this doesn't solve the big problem that there's going to be constantly a susceptibility in language. But when scientists start the process of putting science into language, there should be a rhetorical scholar in the process who is sensitive to the possibility that the language made to a lay audience not mean what it means to the scientist. I mean, at the minimum, this should be a rule that has nothing to do with conspiracy theories. But so we're not going to find all of them that are already out there. But we can, to the extent that we are vigilant when we find them, try to find adjustments and to clearly get the definition that is the accurate definition and accurate understanding under it as quickly as possible. But there is one that I would like, is creating a susceptibility right now. Those of you who read Journal of the American Medical Association, if you look 3 weeks ago, I was the lead author on a piece trying to get the name of the vaccine adverse event reporting system changed. The vaccine adverse event reporting system, by virtue of its aggregation of language, asserts a relationship between the adverse event and the vaccine that is implied to be causal. And what's called a system, it implies that it's an end, vaccine adverse event reporting system. So adverse event ties to vaccine to imply cause. System implies end in itself. This is a system that is intended to be capacious. It's trying to find every possible anything that could have gone wrong. And they ramped it up during COVID because this was a new vaccine, and they needed to be even more vigilant than otherwise. I mean, this was under an emergency use authorization. So there's never been as much searching for possible side effects as under this circumstance. But the fact of the name implies that what's reported to it, which is supposed to be any coincidental health-related problem that might even remotely be associated with the vaccine. The implication that everyone in there actually is vaccine caused is used by people inside the theory to say, look, those deaths, those people died and they died after vaccination. We've now started the causal inference chain. Under the rules in place for reporting on the COVID vaccines, you had to report every death that occurred, whether coincidental or not, if you're a healthcare provider associated with a vaccination temporally, because they were so concerned that they wanted to find every single possibility. In other words, over and above the natural impulse to report a death that's in any way associated temporally within a reasonable number of weeks, we now pushed it to say you get every single one, even if you don't have any reason to think it's associated with the vaccine, because they wanted to be vigilant. What that meant is you had a higher number. You also had a higher number because people were frightened. It's brand new. It's COVID. Everybody's focused on it in media. So you had an over-reporting effect, not on deaths. They were being carefully monitored and reported, but on all these other things. So broken arms were reported. I mean, things with no reasonable inference of malicious intent. I mean, people were trying to make sure that everything was reported. So what I would like to see, and argued in the JAM article with 2 other co-authors, is change the name and make it clear that it's a safety signal or safety signaling or monitoring structure, not system. Because once they see a pattern, they go and look very carefully at all of their other ways of surveillance, many of whom that are not regular self-report. They're actually monitoring population records, including the Medicare system, in order to see what's actually there through those alternative methods. So I changed the word system, and I changed vaccine adverse event, because you have misleading inferences that are fueling concerns about vaccine that are unwarranted by the nature of the system. And that thing we can change right now. So if any of you are in the healthcare system and want to just drop a note to any of your friends at the FDA and CDC, we have no reason to think that can't be changed. And they ought to be thinking about doing it. It's creating a susceptibility. So to answer to the question, we can't do it everywhere always. we should at least do it where we can, and that's one I wish we would do.
Great. The next question kind of continues on this trend, and it asks, are there similarities in forms and genre between conspiracy and state-sponsored false information? Examples are anything bad happening in our country is the fault of foreign instigators. That is to say, I think the way in which I read the question has to do with the way in which the typical patterns of political speech very often will generate causal arguments that have to do with deflecting responsibility or finding patterns that may be hard to sustain.
Yeah. Not only do I agree with the premise of the question, I think that the next moves that people who are interested in a generic theory of this ought to make is to get rid of the word conspiracy theory as a set concept and to start to ask, what's the underlying structure of discourse wherever it is, and what should we call it? So you can parse back an understanding. I mean, a genre is essentially a way of seeing a set of relationships. So figuring out where else those relationships are will help us understand the way in which rhetoric functions in real circumstances, particularly in relationship to institutions. So I think that's not only a good question, it's a good scholarly move to a place that would help the literature. I don't think generic criticism is cookie cutter, in other words. I think if we can get the right set of assumptions, it helps us break out of categories into new understandings. And sometimes that means you throw the genre over.
And this one, I will pair two questions together because I think one creates kind of an illustration of the other one. You mentioned that conspiracy theories do not ground their worldviews in authority because they start from a place of distrusting experts such as scientists. But simultaneously, you highlighted that conspiracy theorists also rely on signals from figures who are then seen as authorizing figures that then mobilize them. The question is, can signals, quote unquote, be read and operate without serving as anchors that can ground conspiracies? Can signals also be groundless? And I'm pairing this with another question, which says, given Trump's apparent inarticulate mishearing, can you describe his strategies as rhetorical? And I think that the questions have to do with this question which is a big question, has always been haunting rhetoric. Can there ever be firm ground from which to...
Yeah, I mean, the ultimate answer is we don't deal in certainty. I mean, rhetoric never has. And the question is, how do you use probabilistic inference with evidence that is granted as evidence by the culture in ways that will drive inferences that the community will grant as legitimate inferences? I mean, in that sense, rhetoric ultimately does construct reality. But to the first point, I'm going to just be very telegraphic because I know we're out of time, and I will stay and answer any questions anybody has individually. I think it's really important to note that Q was anonymous. So if you start out by distrusting authority, what is your signal source? And how would you take that source out of anything that could be destabilized? Meaning it could be destabilized because it's associated with something. Even a person, a race, an ethnicity, a geographic location, Q is anonymous. And the search for who is Q becomes part of a connect the dots. But Q, if there is a Q, there may be multiple Qs. There's no person who then stands up at the end and says, surprise, I'm Q, and everybody says, oh, Q, because if you say that, you've now granted a form of authority, and that, given your premise of distrust, would undermine that person potentially because it would look like they were trying to engage in a power move.
And that reminds me that's a beautiful Hollywood genre ever since The Wizard of Oz.
Yeah.
There's somebody always behind the curtain, and we love those stories.
Yeah, and on the question on Trump, that's lots of books that you're all writing.
Actually, there's a question here that gets at some of that in the sense of what role would you attribute to purposefully gamification in the language of the question in the creation of conspiracy theories as co-creative and pleasurably invitational? That there's some kind of pleasure principle here, that there's a communal spirit here, that there's some kind of attraction here.
Yeah,
this is powerful.
Yeah, I mean, those of you who regularly play games, you know the satisfaction of completing the board. You know, I mean, and think of any game that you play. I mean, you play solitaire, you play Scrabble. Think of that. This connect the dots is fundamentally engaging you in something. The implication is there's something you're getting to. And so, the danger is that you ever get to it and then you abandon the game. But then you start the game over. So, but for practical purposes, yes, I think that's a very important insight. I mean, this doesn't accidentally attract interest. And the profile of people who are disposed to it are people who don't feel they have power and they don't feel that they have agency. Well, how do you get agency? I'm going to give you some agency. You connect the dots. You just connected a dot. You just found something else that's new. You just found another association. So it's actually an agency building genre as it builds tribal identification. And the game part of it is part of the pleasure. And so, take all of these things as a profile and say, now, take all the QAnon, everything out of it. Doesn't that sound like fun? Doesn't that sound like a treasure hunt? I mean, doesn't it sound like activities that we engage in because we're just enjoying doing something? Okay, overlay that on it, and you've got part of the reason that you persist. And there's a reward structure. You've got a community that, there are all those kinds of psychic rewards. So at a point, the point is, how do you feel the community? How does this not become a solitary activity? A big challenge is how do you get from the one to the we in the acronym? And there's a lot of really interesting possibility inside the insights that come from rhetoric and interpersonal communication, two areas of real strength in this program, about how that intersection works in order to build up identity and agency.
And I'm going to skip this question because in some ways, actually, you just answered it. Because the question has to do, is it possible that some folks who feel victimized are more prone to this kind of conspiracy thinking? And you say, yes, there is some kind of ways in which we activate vulnerabilities or we activate a sense of powerlessness and we translate into a form of agency through this conspiracy
And you could
theories.
actually think of that as being therapeutic.
Absolutely.
I mean, you don't want people to feel powerless. You don't want people to feel that they have no agency. I mean, but you'd like that agency to come in ways that are constructive for them, that ultimately have yields for them that will yield fulfilling lives. So, I mean, the question is, how do you take parts of the population that have susceptibilities and harness this so that one addresses susceptibilities in socially constructive, meaningful ways for them?
Mm-hmm. The next question is actually quite big, so please,
These,
the author will forgive it.
Were small.
But influential speech is ever more circulated through sharing brief multimedia memes, which are consumed, elevated, altered by artificial intelligence. How do we manage the outsized effect of AI will have upon genres and co-creative acts? I think that is a very hot question.
Yeah, what's intriguing to me about that is we're training the AI models on what we've already got. So what people forget about AI is instantiating the assumptions that are built into the database that you're scanning in. So the corpus that is being read, and it builds in all the biases that are there. And those of you who've worked in this area know why we're worried about this. So this capacity to grab it and pull it together and assimilate it means it's assimilating a lot of the stereotypic assumptions that are built into our cultural understandings that we do not want to have there because they're not productive. So one of the questions is, as AI brings things forward, is it actually going to work within the genres that we already have that we'd like to, in fact, reform? And we'd like to have genres that are more productive. Or will it, because of its generative capacity, find a way to iterate out of them in ways that find ways to manipulate us more effectively? And my concern about generative AI is the point at which all it does is essentially anticipate the next. So, I mean, that's what it's doing. It's got a huge amount of computing capacity behind figuring out, okay, what would you do? It's got a logic as a result that is in some ways the logic we'd like to think we have, but it's actually not the logic we've conventionalized as humans because we don't have that kind of capacity. So the question is, in that anticipatory move, at the point at which it's starting to anticipate next, when does it start iterating structure as opposed to simply iterating the specific? At the point if it starts doing that, it may draw in patterns of association that are not familiar to us. I mean, we've conventionalized some of these patterns because they're socially constructive. I mean, part of the reason institutions have the genres they have is they sustain institutions. I mean, some of the reasons that we have some of the interpersonal genres that we have is they're personally sustaining. But what happens when this finds ways, because ultimately it has this iterative kind of capacity to break into new kinds of forms, and you amalgamate that with all of the understanding you can program in about human psychology. And that's your fear about, ultimately, does it become something that takes over? So the fear at that point isn't for genre. The fear at that point is power.
And then the final question, I will interpret preemptively as saying, really, Professor Jamieson, keep doing this work. Your Wikipedia page notes that your book arguing that the Russians helped Trump in 2016, quote, has since been debunked.
Yeah, we're trying to address that.
Has it, in your view?
RT and I have an interesting relationship. I don't know if you know Russia Today. Russia Today didn't think highly of my book, Cyberwar. The Russian trolls and I have an interesting relationship as well. And so periodically things get edited into my Wikipedia page, and we're not as vigilant as we spotted this last week. And I said to my staff, okay, somebody's gone back in and edited. That says it's been debunked, and the citation is to Jane Mayer's article in The New Yorker. Read Jane Mayer's article in The New Yorker. It does not debunk. So this is somebody who's playing games with the Wikipedia structure. Wikipedia structure has all the problems with crowdsourcing. I love crowdsourcing. I love Wikipedia. But you've got to be fairly vigilant about these things. And I'm not as vigilant as I should be. But we picked it up last week, and I said to my staff, okay, somebody has to go and hand the Jane Mayer article and say, do you find any sentences in there that say that? And they, oh, no, I guess we have not. And then they're going to change it. But what was the question going to be after we presupposed that somebody did that? And I wasn't vigilant enough to catch it, and my staff hasn't corrected it yet.
So the question was, has it been debunked? Has it in your view? No. If not, who do you think made that entry to your Wikipedia page, which you anticipated wisely?
Yeah, or who knows? It could be conspiracy theorist is just connecting the dots.
And we thank one more time, please join me in thanking Professor Jamieson. The conversation did not end now and here. I know that her work is going to continue. I know that you will have access to it, so I encourage you to seek it out, but also encourage you to join us for reception in the main area outside of the hall, and let the conversation continue. Thank you so much.
Thank you.